Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Reef Resilience webinar on ridge-to-reef management, watershed management for coral reef health. My name is Petra McGowan, and I'm the project manager for the Nature Conservancy's Reef Resilience Program, and I'm hosting the session. This webinar is brought to you through the generous support of John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation and NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program. The agenda for our webinar today is to begin with the presentations from our panelists, and we'll end the webinar with questions from those of you participating. There's an ask questions. First, you can use your chat box anytime throughout the webinar to send questions to the host. We'll keep track of those questions, and we'll ask them to our panelists at the end of the session. Another is to raise your hand, and in your panel, for those of you that haven't done it, you raise them by clicking on the small hand icon at the bottom of the list of participants. We'll take those questions with the raise hands in the order that they were received again at the end of the webinar. If you're having any technical difficulties, trouble hearing or seeing the slides, you can also chat with us, the hosts, and let us know so we can try and webinar. Before we introduce our presenters, I wanted to try and get a better idea a little bit of where people are calling in from for today's webinar, help the presenters know who they're talking to. So for those of you that feel like it, can you use your chat box and let us know what region you work in or where you're calling from? Go. I know you are from, I know some names, but can some people just let me know who's calling from where? I see Hawaii, Seattle. Anyone else want to share with us so we know where people are calling from? Oh. Where, Jordan? Okay, more from Hawaii. From Suze. And Australia. Range of people for different areas. California. Well, this helps kind of as we talk to this remote world. We want to connect with you guys, so thanks for sharing where you're calling from. Great, so now I'm going to introduce our presenters. Carissa Klein is a conservation scientist at the University of Queensland, Australia, Center for Biodiversity and Conservation Science. Primary research interest is in supporting conservation decisions in the Coral Triangle. Her expertise is in spatial conservation prioritization, as well as involvement in projects to do with climate change adaptation, ecosystem services, and sustainable seafood. Our panelist, or they're kind of co-doing this webinar, is Stacy Jupiter. She's the director of the Wildlife Conservation Society Fiji Country Program, and she's been working with local communities and the Fijian government since 2008 to develop integrated ridge-to-reef management plans, use science-based and participatory tools. Prior to work in Fiji, Stacy spent 5 years investigating the impacts of long-term changes in catchment land use on nearshore water quality and ecosystem health in Great Barrier Reef, Australia. Thanks again to our panelists for joining, and I'd like to turn it over to Carissa.
Hello, thank you guys for coming to tuning up to this webinar. This is Carissa Klein. I can't see the presentation on here, Jordan. Okay, so first slide. So I'm going to start this presentation, and Stacy's going to pick up in a bit, and we're kind of going to go back and forth telling a story about a project that we've been working on together for a few years in Fiji on forest conservation that can impact coral reef outcomes. So, as you know, just as I do, coral reefs are by a lot of things occurring both in the sea, things like overfishing, and on the land. to do runoff and various land use developments. But we're doing conservation. We're heavily focused on remove threats to coral reefs. Excuse me, I'm a bit sick. Threats to coral reefs happening in the sea, and often neglecting what's going on in the land. So, an example of that is that, we're on implementing marine protected areas, which are great at removing over threats, but you can still arguably not protect your coral reef if you're not dealing with what's happening upstream in some cases. So before I get into the Fiji study, I just want to briefly introduce a project that we did prior to this, and this is kind of how Stacy and I came to know each other, is here at the University of Queensland, as part of an NC's working group, we wanted to look at these questions of in what cases and where can evaluate when marine versus terrestrial conservation is better instrument for conserving coral reefs. And so we did a really simple, broad-scale study across the coral triangle, which is the region shown here, and we evaluated places. And what we did is we said, what's the best investment and where in terms of protecting coral reefs? And from this finding, the only thing I really want to talk about is that what we found is terrestrial conservation actions can benefit coral reefs more than marine conservation in some places. And this is a really important finding because we don't often focus on the land when we're protecting coral reefs. And that's how Stacy and I came to know each other, through this study. As she saw it, and she said, this would be really interesting to refine and apply at a finer scale in Fiji. And I'm going to hand this over to Stacy now.
Carissa, I hope you can hear me. Hello, this is Stacy talking now. Hi to those of you that I know and those that I don't. Building on the story, we wanted to take the model that Carissa and others had done for the coral triangle and see how we could develop a more spatially explicit approach to look at the questions of how does forest conservation influence reef health, and also where does forest conservation most cost effectively influence reef health. We focus on Fiji not just because I was part of the working group, but also because in Fiji we're fortunate to have a large amount of spatial data that cover the land and sea. There's also the timing of this project coincided with a really strong government push to expand National Protected Area Network, and I'll talk about it shortly. And there's also real current momentum in Fiji for doing integrated coastal management and integrated planning, and I'll touch on that again. And further, this isn't really just a paper conservation planning exercise. In Fiji, we actually have real opportunities to turn these conservation models and plans into practice on the ground. So before we jump into the model and what we actually done, I just wanted to give some Fiji-specific background for those of you who aren't familiar with this part of the world. And I will talk you through a little bit about the legal framework that we're dealing with in Fiji. So like I'm sure most of the areas where you are coming from in various parts of the world, Fiji is no different in that there's a lot of overlaps in coastal governance, particularly different agencies that are regulating activities on different parts of hydrologically connected watersheds to reef areas. So for example, as you can see in the slide, logging and forest activities are regulated by the Department of Forest, but if you wanted to do activity that involved clearing mangroves, you've had to go talk to Department of Lands. And often Department of Forestry and Department of Lands aren't even talking to each other and issue separate permits. Rules regulating development, if you build a resort or put in a jetty, they're covered under the Environmental Management Act, which is regulated by the Department of Environment, but they don't necessarily apply to all activities in the village, and those are regulated under provincial bylaws. And again, two agencies aren't always talking to each other. So you can see that there are real complications and overlaps with the legal structure. However, on the positive side of things, in Fiji and in practice, most day-to-day management of the lands and the areas is actually regulated by communities. Actually moved on to this slide. But the communities in Fiji have a long-standing custom of managing across reef units through a system of stewardship that in Fiji we call the vanua, which is actually defined as what we consider a duty of care, which binds people together with their king groups across the land and the sea. So it's possible, even despite all this complications in coastal governance, to work with community groups to develop integrated ridge-to-reef management plans, provisions for looking after forests and freshwater and marine areas simultaneously. Okay, next slide. Great. So in order to try to overcome some of these governance overlaps, there have been multiple cross-sectoral agencies that have been set up in Fiji to try to review and harmonize different types of existing and new environmental policy and to identify opportunities for where we can expand these protected area networks. So these include committees like the National Protected Area Committee and Integrated Coastal Management Committee, and I serve as an NGO representative on both the Protected Area Committee and ICM Committee, which you'll hear me talk more about. And these committees, like the Wetland Steering Committee, are composed of representatives from government, from NGOs, from private sector, industry, and in cases from communities. They report directly to the National Environment Council. Now, the Environment Council is a much higher level body that's composed of people like permanent secretaries from the different government line ministries, and their job is to, in principle, review any draft environmental policy before it's circulated to cabinet that would then bring it into policy or potentially law for Fiji. Next. Next. Excellent. Great. So getting into how Fiji has been moving towards expanding its national protected area network and looking towards integrated coastal management. So these set rather ambitious targets to protecting terrestrial and marine ecosystems, and these are actually exceed the HE targets that were agreed to by parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity in Nagoya in 2010. So in 2005, the Fiji government first announced that they have a goal to effectively protect 30% of its marine areas by 2020. And after that, in 2007, the Fiji Department of Forestry set out a goal to protect 40% of the remaining forest, which amounts to about 20% of land area by 2020. So in order to actually make this and implement this on the ground, a National Protected Area Committee was formed in 2008 as a technical advisory group to the FCC, as you saw in the last slide. And one of the first things that the Protected Area Committee was tasked to do under the CBD's formal work of protected areas was carry out a gap analysis to see how are land areas and our sea areas represented under the current network of protected areas. Now, land, those tend to be more top-down, government and regulated protected areas, but in marine and coastal environments, those tend to be more community-based and locally managed marine areas. So in 2010, we completed a marine gap analysis, which has been published in Conservation Biology, and if anyone's interested in the paper, we can circulate it through this network later. And we showed approximately 12% of Fiji's marine habitats have been effectively protected. And this, we ran a simulation that indicated that if communities add new protected areas of about the same size and the same rate, with considerable expansion by 2020 on their own, communities are unlikely to help the government achieve the full 30% target by 2020. So it suggests that we really push harder through the top-down frameworks as well if we want to achieve that 30% target. Now, at the time, a terrestrial gap analysis was done, and this showed that the current system was inadequate in terms of land area representation, with only 2%, 7% of land currently protected. However, there's recognition that we need action on this, and Fiji currently has a rather large $7 million under its JEF4 application, which is going to be used to implement new terrestrial protected areas. At the same time, there's been growing momentum for integrated coastal planning, and this occurred on both community levels as well as upper levels in government. So in 2009, we, within WCS, worked with communities of Kumba District to complete Fiji's district-level ridge-to-reef plan, which is, we're using it and other groups are potentially using it as a template for setting up these ridge-to-reef management networks in other areas of Fiji. And also in 2009, the ICM committee was established with a mandate to develop a national coastal plan. And the first step in this process in 2011, the Department of Environment put out a national integrated coastal management framework with the main recommendation that these types of plans be enacted at the provincial level. So currently, the first steps of building these provincial level plans are being taken across 4 provinces. So the next step is to actually prioritize where we need to do this linked integrated land team management. And the prioritization work was done with myself and some colleagues in Fiji that we published in Aquatic Conservation. As you can see, this map I used a pretty simplistic ranking-based approach with broad management units. So in talking about this with Carissa and others in the MC's working group, we thought that there was considerable room for improvement. Back to Carissa to explain the model. I just want to briefly touch on why is there this urgency in Fiji. Well, we've been suffering major flooding events with increasing frequency and severity in Fiji, particularly over the past few years since 2009. And this is mostly because over 70% of Fiji's native forests are cleared. So the areas that are hardest hit are those that have been subject to the most land alteration, land clearing. And those are actually a lot of those orange areas that you saw on the map in the previous slide. So the flooding events have resulted in severe impacts to downstream infrastructure and also health impacts in terms of waterborne disease outbreaks, but no one even really assessed what the impacts are to downstream freshwater and coastal marine ecosystems and how they may impact on people's livelihoods. So there's really a pressing concern in Fiji, and there's really need to take action. So back to Carissa to go through a few of the details of the model.
Yeah, like I said, I'm going to go through a specific process in Fiji, looking at prioritizing based actions to protect reefs. And then there we're going to move on to talking about how we've future work in this area and how we're developing this work and applying it in other places. So with any spatial conservation prioritization project, whether it's to do with marine reserves, terrestrial reserves, regardless, the key to doing this is making sure that up front we have a really clear objective so we know what we're trying to prioritize for. In this particular study, we went through a lot of different objectives and we settled on the following one. And what we're trying to do is maximize coral reef condition through investment in terrestrial protected areas across Fiji's coastal watersheds. And we focused on the 3 largest islands in Fiji that are shown here in this map. And to give you a little bit of context, in Fiji, this green is shown on this map are the areas that are currently forested in Fiji, and the blue areas are areas where coral reef exists. So the first thing we had to do in this particular study is define what is the condition of every coral reef in Fiji. And as you guys know, as coral reef managers and scientists, this is a really hard thing to do. And the one's going to go and snorkel and scuba dive across every single coral reef in Fiji and determine this. So what we had to do is we had to take our best guess in this particular case study because we had such a large study region, all of Fiji. And so what we did is we created a model for coral reef health. And I'm going to walk you briefly through this model and what it entails. But I want to emphasize that any model for coral reef health could be used in this particular prioritization approach. It doesn't have to be this particular one, but this is the one that was most relevant in Fiji given available data and the context there. So what is we simply defined the health of every single coral reef on the basis of a few things. The first being water-based pollution, the second being ocean pressure, and then we had to know a little bit regarding the expected condition of overfished reef with no pollution. So the 2 parameters that are circled, watershed-based pollution, fishing pressure, are things that we also had to use data to populate them with. And I'll explain those 2 things in the next slides. And these other things are parameters that we got here and we varied, and we did a big sensitivity analysis to see what the effect of these things are on priorities in Fiji, because these things are obviously up for debate and can vary quite a bit. So, but I want to just focus on these first two things: how to find watershed-based pollution and fishing pressure in this particular model to get our coral reef condition. So first, what we did is we modeled coral reef watershed-based pollution, and we did that through a combination of a couple of models. So some of you would be familiar with Reefs at Risk. So we used the model that they developed as a proxy for sediment and nutrient runoff. And what we did is we, by using more specific data in Fiji, applied that model to calculate for every little subcatchment shown here in this map, how much pollution will be coming from that subcatchment. And then what we had to say is, okay, where does that pollution pour out into the ocean? Where is its pour point? And finally, how does that pollution distribute to coral reefs across Fiji? So that's that three-step process there. So together with the Reefs at Risk model, we also combined it with some work from Ben Halpern's group at the University of California, Santa Barbara, to figure out how much pollution was reaching each reef in Fiji. And then we had to define was fishing pressure in Fiji. And again, there wasn't really specific data for every single reef and how much fishing pressure was occurring in every reef in Fiji. So we did a lot of different things here, a lot of different approaches, and we decided this was the best guess for Fiji. So in Fiji, fishing pressure is roughly correlated with coastal population. So what we did is we calculated the number of people living within a certain distance of each reef in order to capture a majority of the population living in coastal districts where the fishermen people are likely to live. And all of this information and data was sort of verified by Stacy and people in Fiji, as you know, to make sure that it wasn't completely off guard. But things like this, if there's better information for fishing pressure, better data, if better data becomes available, you can put it into the model and hopefully get improved, more accurate outcomes. So moving this, we often do in our conservation planning approaches is we like to consider how much it costs to implement some sort of conservation action on the land or the sea, rather than ignoring these costs, because these costs are really important as conservation impacts people, and it's quite expensive. So given limited money for conservation, we like to incorporate economic aspects. The way we did this is again focused on the land and used the land opportunity cost that was calculated from current logging concessions obtained from the Fiji Native Land Board Trust. So it didn't ignore management costs, but was much more focused on lost opportunities from implementing conservation action. So we had to compile this information on runoff and reef health and socioeconomic costs and prioritize which bits of land were best to protect for coral reef health. And we can approach the standard approach used in most business and economics decision-making called return on investment. And basically all you do is you calculate the rate of return on investment of your conservation action. So in this particular case, our return was improvement in coral reef health. So if you implement a terrestrial protected area, how much does that improve coral reef health versus if that area were cleared? And the investment was just the cost of protecting that forest. So we got for every single pixel across Fiji, the pixels at one by 1K size to determine where these best investments were. So now what I'm going to do is just go through a couple of the really key results that we got out of this. First one was answering that question that Stacy raised, is how does forest conservation influence reef health in Fiji? I found that if coral reef condition can improve by over 50% if the remaining forest in Fiji is protected rather than deforested. So quite large improvements can be made. So, that just sort of states the obvious that protecting your forest is a good thing for coral reef health. Then what we wanted to do is look a little bit more in detail into that and answering the question that Stacy raised, is where does forest conservation most influence reef health? Because, as you know, some places are going to deliver greater benefits for coral reef health than others. I found that was quite striking in Fiji, and that, if you protect one area versus another area, you can get over 400 times the benefit. So there's a huge return investment this particular study. So these areas that are dark blue here are areas that we found were going to be really good assessments for coral reef health, and red and orangey areas are going to be less important for coral reef health. Focusing, where this study is focusing on those blue areas for achieving terrestrial conservation goals. It's going to be a lot better for coral reefs than the other areas. I'm going to hand it back to Stacy for a bit.
So next question of where to from here. So at the end of 2011, I presented back the findings of this model to the rest of the Protected Area Committee. And while they liked the approach and they could immediately recognize the benefits of integrated planning, the biggest question that came up was, well, what about all of our terrestrial priorities? Is there some way that you can put in terrestrial habitat representation and the things that the terrestrial people care about at the time into this model? So I went back to the starting blocks with other colleagues, and currently we've been developing some new work that compares the outcomes of several different scenarios, different networks of protected areas, and evaluates how well simultaneously meet these terrestrial habitat representation targets of a range of terrestrial habitats at 20% each, while providing benefits to down reefs. And so the areas that we've been currently examining include some key areas that have been selected by the Protected Area Terrestrial Working Group. It was a ranking system, and their priorities were based on things like endemic biodiversity richness, economic importance, conservation practicality, and some of these things that you can't necessarily easily spatially quantify. And we paired that against techniques where we use Marksan, conservation decision support software, to systematically select areas to achieve these terrestrial habitat targets, preferentially in areas that were priorities by the PAC for terrestrial conservation. And we also compared these against areas that were systematically selected to yield the highest benefits to coral reefs. And so, interestingly, what we found is that the PAC working group priority forest areas, they actually did a better job in terms of benefits to downstream coral reefs than areas that were systematically selected by Marksan. The PAC priority forests all did a very poor job in representing terrestrial habitat targets. They actually only included a number of different types of terrestrial protected instead of the amount of area in each of the areas. So, in terms of the next steps, what we do is take these further recommendations back to the PAC and show outputs of these different scenarios and how they compare. And my fear is that once I sit down with people in the room and show them how poorly the boundaries of their current priorities actually represent terrestrial habitat, that they're going to want to make some tweaks to boundaries so that they improve terrestrial habitat representation while at the same time using this model so we can also maximize improvements or benefits to downstream coral reefs and other freshwater and marine coastal systems. So this process that we're going through, is, as I said, it's not just a paper exercise. This will actually help us select in the top priority areas for management under funds that are already available under DEF 4 allocation to Fiji. And then the thing that we'll do is once all of these areas are finalized and the borders are agreed on, we'll get maps that can then be distributed to all of the different government ministries that are responsible for issuing permits for development or any type of natural resource extraction. So even if these protected areas don't get established immediately, perhaps the government officials who are responsible for issuing the permits will think twice before issuing a permit if they see that it falls within the boundaries of these priority areas for management. So, Carissa.
Yes, to wrap it up. So I just want to give you a bit of an example of other work that we're doing in this area. Where we're further developing these models and these prioritization approaches, just so you can get your head around how this can be applied in other contexts. And just to mention, the send all this work is really in its infancy. There's not much that's been done. So, the initial studies, although they seem quite simplistic, realistic. They're trying to accomplish, one thing at a time and then advance it so that everything can sort of be incorporated into these prioritization approaches. And some of the key projects that we've been working on, we've been in touch, we've been contacted by quite a few organizations since doing this work in Fiji, Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, WWF working in the Great Barrier Reef, to try these in other places. And so basically, in New Guinea and Indonesia, what we're doing with some of these organizations is we're looking at various alternative land uses, other things that are happening other than protected areas versus just plain clear, and looking at what their contribution or their impact is on marine ecosystems as well as fisheries. And this work is being led here at the University of Queensland and is the focus of some PhD students, Tillich, who's on this talk as well. So we're answering questions like, if there's heaps of palm oil upstream, where's the best investment for putting in reserves, or how can you best manage your fisheries given these impacts that are happening? We're looking at questions like, if landscape that is forested but is slated to have developments, whether it be a ring road or a rubber plantation or mining, where are the best places to locate those activities to minimize impacts on marine ecosystems as well as fisheries? So some really good questions there that are relevant to a lot of places on this side of the world. Other things here in Australia is Great Barrier Reef, it's run for its biodiversity and its protection levels as well. There's an incredible network of marine protected area there, but one problem with Great Barrier Reef is it experiences a lot of runoff from land. There's a lot of hurricane farming and various other land uses occurring there. That's a big concern, and it's not really dealt with quite properly. So what we're looking at is how do you better manage these farms, and where are the best investments, what catchments are we focusing on in terms of management of these farms and deliver outputs to Australia's Great Barrier Reef. So that's it in a nutshell. So kind of watch this space for various activities there. We're very interested in collaborating with people and working with people on these various projects, so don't hesitate to get in touch if we can be of use in the place that you are working. And also just to highlight, we've been mentioning lots of different places where we've written these studies up. We sent you out 3 studies to do with landscaping recently, and I think you got those on email. But there they are here, and if you didn't get them, please feel free to email me, and I'm happy to distribute those. And I think that's all. I'm happy to take questions now.
All right. Thanks, Carissa and Stacy. We're going to take questions now, so you can either chat with the host or raise your hand, and those are 2 ways that we will see the questions. So I have a question that I'll start with for you. I'm not sure who's best to answer, but back to the model, I think this is referencing the maps that you showed of priority areas. In the model, what are the characteristics of the blue priority areas? Why are they more important to protect than the other areas?
I'm happy to answer that. So that would be to do with a combination of things. So it gets back at the model in terms of how much watershed-based pollution is coming from the catchments, how much fish pressure is going downstream, and then how much it costs to protect those land and those catchments. So it would be a combination of all of those things that we put into the prioritization approach. And basically those catchments would be delivering the most per dollar spent. So that's the best investment. So it might not be minimizing the most threat across Fiji, but it would be minimizing the most threat per dollar spent.
All right. I will hope I answered the question that the participant had. Not, they can chat with me more on that, and I can ask you guys. Any other questions for our panelists? You can raise your hands or send a question in the chat box. I have one more again. I'll just let you guys decide who's best to answer. What's the total cost of a type of study like this, not funding-wise and time-wise? Just so we get an idea of what kind of commitment they're they want to do something like this?
Stacy, I don't know if you're best to answer that on me, but it sort of depends. Sometimes we do these things for free. Sometimes we do them as a consultancy. It really depends on what's involved in the project. If you're already doing something in that area, then, in cases this is a lot less. But if it's a break study where it's going to involve heaps of data collection and new models, then it might cost a bit more. But it really depends. Like, people at the Queensland, for example, I'd be funded. I'm on a fellowship to focus on land sea planning, and we've got PhD students that are writing their PhD on this. So if it's quite on with what we're doing, then the costs are quite minimal. But if not, then usually engage in some sort of consultancy. So I'll just say it really depends.
Right.
Stacy, now just
go ahead.
I'll to add that the costs will depend on whether you have the data or not that you need. So in this case, we use already free available data, so there were no costs for data collection. The only actual costs incurred were a track that we set up for some of Carissa's time. So that's through the University of Queensland. And, if you look at back to the study versus the cost, it was only about $15,000. So we feel like it was pretty cheap cost.
Okay, thanks. I have some more questions. I'm going to keep asking and let you guys decide who's best to answer. To what extent are LMMA sites engaged in collaborating to support this approach?
This is Stacy. The stone of locally marine areas, or LMMAs, is that the communities are setting type of management to meet their own local objectives. So the gap analysis, we took under consideration that all of these areas across Fiji, and there are 400 of them that have been established, were all set up for local community objectives and were not set out to meet the national targets of 30%. So we wanted to see, just on the basis of local objectives alone, how much would be effectively covered. And a good percentage. We used kind of way of doing the gap analysis where we considered that not all types of management activities were equally effective. So a no-take, no-access marine protected area would be better protected than an area where you may only have some species area restrictions, and we set some leading factors on that. So the actual area covered under all of the LMMAs in Fiji is much greater than 12% of the habitats, but we consider 12% effectively protected. So the second step of modeling we did would be, if as the LMMA network was expanded to 2020, would it reach that 30% target? I found that probably not, and suggests that we can't necessarily expect communities to take on the full responsibility of achieving the national government objective on their own. And if the national government really wants to achieve the objective, they're going to have to put some resources in and incentivize communities to actually set aside larger amounts of areas or under stricter protection than they would have naturally wanted to do just to meet their local objectives.
Thanks, and I apologize. I'm reading a whole bunch of questions while you're talking, and so if you answered this already, just tell me. But following up on that, how, if so, how were LLMA sites engaged in collaborating to support the approach you guys took?
But building on from that, so what made the LMMA sites where management was initially established, the typical communities would a no-take area, which is they call it Tambu area in Fiji, start with fairly simple marine management measures. Now, as people have been gaining this momentum towards more integrated coastal planning, as these have been established and as communities have gotten into the practice of implementing management, many have started adding different types of land and freshwater management into systems. So they're slowly building into integrated management plans. Now, are they doing this to meet these national targets? No, of course not. However, there is money available through these financing mechanisms that could provide incentives if the government wants to set aside larger areas to offset the management costs with the community.
All right. Okay, I have more questions. Are you using any decision support tools to communicate your results to government officials and other stakeholders?
Stacy?
Yes, coming back to me again. No specific tools as far as communication goes. My take with communication is try to break it down into the simplest key messages available and use nice visuals. People can understand the objectives very clearly, and then what are the key actions that they could do to make a difference to meet those objectives.
Have here at our research center we have a sort of, I think it's a monthly magazine that comes out that is sent to a lot of government people, mainly in Australia, but all over the world. It's called Decision Point, and it basically has one or two page articles on science that's coming out from the institution, but broken down into really key, simple messages. So that's our sort of main form of communication.
In the presentation, you said that Fiji's reefs could improve by, I think it was 50 or 58% if they protected existing forest. The question is, what is meant by protection? How is private land addressed?
In that particular study, define protection as implementing some sort of national park or any sort of conservation measure. And we didn't really address specific conservation measures like what people do on private land. So we just said, if existing forest, if it's available for protection, if we protect it versus clear it for another land use, what is it? So it's a simplistic assumption. Some of this work is going to be to consideration various land use types and tenures and things like that, and how they contribute towards all of this.
Stacey, just the reality is on the ground in Fiji is that it's not particularly simple to set up a protected area due to in this land tenure. So Indigenous landowners hold tenure over about 88% of Fiji land. And any type of negotiated agreement to set up a protected area needs to come through the landowners, and that's why this Utopia Land Trust Board has been established to participate in these negotiations with landowners. So the only mechanisms that legally exist right now to set aside a parcel of land with landowners is that under the forestry, they could become nature reserves. However, the Forest Department has no resources to take on any new nature reserves at the time. Under the Water Catchment Act, something like that, an area that's important for water catchments could be purchased on lease, so it would become a no-access area. And this has been done through agencies like the Water Board in Fiji and Water Authority in order to make sure that polluting certain sensitive water catchment areas. And the third way that's talented but it's very expensive is to set up a conservation lease. And so money needs to be raised or put aside in order to make compensation payments to landowners to basically agree not to use their land for any sort of extractive activities and be set aside.
So the next question is kind of twofold. What have been the greatest challenges in implementing this model or doing this study in Fiji, and how did you overcome it? And second of that is same question, challenges for implementation of the outcomes of what you're hoping to achieve in Fiji. So it's probably a question for both of you to answer.
talk about model, the data is challenging.
Yeah. I'll talk about the model and the data and the challenges there, and then Stacy can talk about implementing outcomes in Fiji. So I would say in doing studies like this, the greatest challenge is because often working in places that have a lot of data for these particular things is coming up with sorts of proxies to represent what we need to represent, like fishing pressure or health. The biggest challenge is making these big jumps and these estimations in a way that's so realistic. And I think we probably spent the most time on that, in deciding how to model these various things, how to model reef health, how to model, core watershed loss, how to model fishing pressure, and all of those things. Given perfect data, all of that stuff would be really, really straightforward. The whole prioritization approach. That would be my take on it. And Stacy, what about implementation on the ground?
I would have to say that as far as pricing where conservation investment has gone in Fiji, historically it's been very arbitrary, and often it goes to the person who's got the loudest voice in the room, who's directing money to where they're from. So the challenge is going to be to get people to divorce their attachments to the places they're from and try to look at what's best for Fiji on a whole and where we should invest what's the most urgent investment, and then leave these areas as priorities that we could maybe come to later when more money comes in.
Another question for you guys is, what messages can be communicated to land managers if you have no data or study like this for these other places?
This is Stacy again. Go ahead.
You go, Stacy.
One of the key ones that people really picked up on here, which is kind of an obvious one, but it was nice that this just validated, is that it's necessarily worth investing in setting up marine protected areas in areas where there's been high amounts of land clearing and considerable catchment alteration. You had some specialties in that. There was some specific endemic marine organism there that was the only place it was found, and that you wanted to conserve it. But basically, when you're looking in across the whole country and investment priorities, putting new marine protected areas at the mouth of large rivers and highly degraded catchments is a bad idea. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, much to add to that. The only thing I would add is just with our land managers and the people managing the sea and the land, it's often really separate, and what I'm finding is that people often don't even talk to each other. So just trying to be a bit more integrated in terms of making management decisions and talking to people. So when decisions are on the land, they can be at least thoughtful of what's occurring in the ocean. And and the first step of doing that is just talking to the people that are governing.
Another question is, if you had access to more data, how would you improve the model?
Again, we just, with the model, if we had better data, you could just easily insert it into the model rather than the current data. So if you had, better data for fishing pressure, you need the actual fisher on every coral reef over time, that would be as well as the economic information. So economic information plays a huge role in it comes up as a high and low priority. And knowing how cost to manage and the opportunity costs of implementing various conservation actions inputting that into the model, I think, would make a big difference in terms of the priorities.
Well, some of the big assumptions in the model, because we didn't have data. One was that flood plume dispersion was just kind of 4 points in linear decay, or was it linear or exponential? I don't remember. But it didn't incorporate any kind of actual flood plume version data, what currents might do, or what any of the hydrology might do. We also didn't have any data on specific catchment hydrology or soil types that would influence the tide amount and the quality of runoff. So these kind of things could be the data would vastly improve the model.
Yeah.
Last chance for questions from everybody. If you want to raise your hand, you can. We are getting to the end of our webinar, and I wanted to give one last opportunity for people to send any of their questions or raise their hand. Panelists have any other thoughts they'd like to add? I have one more question here. If in my place, I'm reading it from the perspective person. Where should these managers or practitioners look for, if you guys have ideas for them to look for sources of funding or partnerships to implement this kind of thing in their regions or regions they work? Do you guys have ideas for them on that?
Sure.
Just it didn't specify, so just we then this will go globally to people we work with, so lots of regions.
Now the NIFWIF Fish and Wildlife Foundation has a call to implement ecosystem-based management in areas that are typically taught as priorities on NOAA's coral reef international conservation strategy. I mixed up the words that. But that proposals are due early February, so you could look into that if necessary. Or if interested. Of the big U.S. foundations, like Greg Foundation, McCarthy Foundation, have been very interested on the community side of things and investing in this type of integrated planning and ecosystem-based management, but there are specific geographies that they're focused on. You'd have to match up with their funding priorities.
All right.
What I'll have to add to that is this requires a bit of funding already existing, but most people outside Australia wouldn't know about this, but it's useful for people outside of Australia, is that we've got a program through the Australian Research Council called a Linkage Program, and what it does is, say an NGO says, I've got this really interesting study that I would do, and I've got this much money that I want to invest, in doing it. Well, if they partner up with a researcher in Australia, application, if it's successful, then the Australian government matches that funding. So it's a way to really leverage and double your funding to accomplish various projects. So that we were able, when I was working in Australia, how we were able to get funding to look at land sea threats and impact issues in the Great Barrier Reef was through an ARC linkage partnering with a council, resource management body, and also the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Well, we're near the end of the time for our webinar, so I wanted to thank both of our panelists for presenting and answering all the participant questions. Thanks for all you participants joining the webinar, and I want to give a special thanks to Sherry Wagner, who helped volunteer her time to put the idea for this webinar together and help plan the logistics for it. The record for this webinar, as well as the resource links, are going to be sent out on the Reef Resilience Network email list tomorrow. If you're not on the list and you'd like to be, email us at resilience@tnc.org. And we're always open to suggestions for future webinar topics and how to make these webinars useful for managers and practitioners out there in the field. field. So thanks again for your participation, and look for our next webinar announcement soon, where we'll be doing one in February or March. So thanks again, panelists and participants.
Thank you.
Thanks.